Hi, this is Peter Woolfolk. First, thank you so very much for being a listener to the Public Relations Review podcast. I would really appreciate your leaving a review of the podcast. Let me know what you think. To make it easy, you can go directly to the podcast website, and that is publicrelationsreviewpodcast.com. There, you can go directly to the review page to leave your review. So let me know what you think of the podcast. And again, thank you so very, very much for being a listener.
Welcome. This is the Public Relations Review podcast, a program to discuss the many facets of public relations with seasoned professionals, educators, authors, and others. Now, here is your host, Peter Woolfolk.
Welcome to the Public Relations Review podcast and to our listeners all across America and around the world. Now, Apple has ranked this podcast among the top 1% of podcasts worldwide. And recently, FeedSpot listed this podcast as number 13 on its top 70 best public relations podcasts in the United States. So thank you to all of our guests and listeners for your continued support. And if you enjoy the podcast, please leave a review. Welcome. And here's the question for the audience. Does your business or organization have an individual responsible for managing all external and internal communication strategies? Is it important who oversees all messaging and media from investor relations to crisis communications and more? My guest today considers how projects and programs come together for clients to receive information, be that reading, seeing, hearing, or experiences. Joshua Altman is the Managing Director of Beltway Media in Washington, D.C. His experience includes harnessing data-driven methods, behavioral science principles which provide an edge in public affairs, policy, and crafting compelling narratives. So, Joshua, thank you so very much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
The question now becomes, how do you begin to use how clients receive information to begin crafting strategies behind behavioral sciences and so forth to have them strategically and effectively deliver their messages?
I think that's a great place to really start this because you're asking how we kind of begin a project. How are they getting their information? So it starts with a conversation with that client. What are they doing? And in some cases, the answer is actually a blank slate. They're really not doing much in terms of their communications, especially in an integrated way. So in terms of how they're getting information, sometimes it's just, their customers, their clients talking to them. Other times, they're running LinkedIn ads or, doing the occasional, blue sky Twitter X post. And they're just looking at, reposts and comments. And that's how they're getting their information. And for us, we look at that when we're beginning to craft these strategies using things like behavioral science, which really just is a fancy way of saying understanding why individuals and groups act the way they act. Mm-hmm. And from there, we can start working with them to get usually better and more information to start informing better decisions.
So does it also depend exactly on what the project is, maybe and their target audience as to how you then begin crafting what the specific message, not only the specific message is going to be and how it's going to be crafted, but also how it's going to be delivered to their audiences?
Always matters. One of the things we talk about a lot at my firm is, what people read, see, hear, and experience. So if you are, a federal agency, and your audience is, 300 plus million American adults or 330-ish million Americans overall, that's going to be very different than if you are a B2B firm working specifically in the energy industry. So kind of who their audience is and what they get is very different. And if you're a federal agency and you have, hundreds of millions of people in your audience, you got to cover a lot more bases than, say, that B2B energy firm, which, you know where those trade shows are. You know who the decision makers at companies are. You can get a list of companies that you are trying to reach out to and know who your audience is. One firm I spoke with at one point, they were saying, we kind of know who we want. We have a list of 100 decision makers who we're targeting. Like, well, that's a small audience.
Right.
That's very small. Like, you got to, sometimes in emails, you're looking for, depending on what you're going for. And opens, you're obviously looking for a lot more, 30-ish%, maybe 40 on the low end. That's 40 people in that particular audience. So your open rate better be really good if you're targeting that, if you're using emails, as opposed to getting 40 people out of 330 million plus Americans. Big difference in your rate there. So who they're trying to reach out to and kind of what they hear back from is important. And the flip side of that, when you're dealing with a company like that, B2B energy firm with a list of 100 decision makers, it could be very personalized. Like, your feedback is, we know that, Joe Smith told us on this date that this is what they're looking for. It's like, we can work with that, so you can really get personalized, actionable feedback when you have such a small list, which is an advantage, but it is a very small list.
Mm-hmm. That's one of the things you brought up, of course, is working with the federal government. And I don't believe we've had a guest on here that's actually done spoken in detail about working not only with the federal government, but before, but also with and for the federal government. I've done both. Let's talk about the federal government for a moment or so, as to how there are different audience and how you have to do more for them to get whatever their messages are out.
Yeah, so I was a federal contractor at two different agencies, the Department of Justice and the Department of Commerce. And with that, so I was not a federal employee. I was a contractor. I was a subcontractor,
okay.
Actually. So when you're a federal employee, there are different things going on. As, in my role as a contractor, as a subcontractor, you have to reach a lot of people. Like I said, there are about 300-ish million American adults. Add in, children, you're up to about 330 million or so, plus or minus, a couple million. And reaching them requires, you got to hit everyone. Mm-hmm. You have in terms of the U.S., these agencies covered everywhere from, the North Atlantic to the South Pacific. We covered Guam. Because they are, we had people there, and we had to communicate with that population, with that audience. So it's a lot in terms of just geography. And of course, you're thinking the internet, borderless, but people are different across geographies. Mm-hmm. And you got to, figure out what you got to do to reach them. Your audiences are, of course, very different. We're not trying to reach someone in a specific age demographic in a lot of cases. We were, in terms of reaching, public external audiences, reaching everyone and trying to make tools that anyone in the U.S. would use and be comfortable accessing, which can be a lot when you have that many people of that, level of diversity. And I think a lot of agencies really do a great job doing it, considering that it's a big lift to, reach that many people who have, just diverse experiences and backgrounds, mm-hmm. who, need to get information in, very different ways. So we would, of course, do things, just like any, commercial business would do. We had, images, we had infographics. If we had people who were going to in-person events, they brought one-pagers with them that, I worked with the agency to do the content and design. So that would work with people who maybe weren't online as much.
Well, one of the things that I think that because I work for the Department of Education, and one of the things is that, yes, there are a lot of people there, but also some of that audience can be broken down to smaller groups. For one of the things I had to do was to put together a satellite meeting for community college people around the country. Mm-hmm. Well, that was a much smaller audience. Had to hook up the satellite in Washington and get it fed around to all over the country. The big part of it was, where am I going to get this thing downloaded? Well, the thing I found out was that, a lot of community colleges do have satellite systems where they do pull down information. So, and there was an Office of Community Colleges in the department. So working with them, I knew who I could call on to pull the signal down. And but then there's also the question of getting the signal up to them. So I learned a lot, over there. And also the diversification of the audiences. Yes, I mean, the federal government reaches the entire population for some things. Depending upon what it is, it might be just a smaller part of the population. But the government working for them is a whole different system as compared to working for the private industry people.
Yes, and you were dealing with satellite uplinks and downloads. More recently, we do webinars just like
that's right.
When I was with agencies. It's Zooms and team webinars and GoToMeetings, and it's a very different situation. So you don't have to worry as much now about dealing with those satellite links, which of course were very expensive. Running webinars still has costs associated, of course, but in terms of budget conscious, spending taxpayer dollars, it is a much lower number of dollars when you are working on a GoToMeeting or Microsoft Teams webinar or Zoom than you are when you're trying to do satellite uplinks and downloads.
Well, yeah, I was reviewing my age when I was doing that, but it was doing that was a big thing then. You're absolutely right.
It was.
It
wasn't that long ago.
And it wasn't that long ago.
Doing them. I remember earlier in my career we would use satellites in special virtual systems that you had to call in and get special internet for. It was not as easy as it is today at all, which I think is great because it means private companies and government can be in more places and reach people much more directly than when you had to be at the community college where they had the satellite connection available.
That's right. Well, one of the other things I mentioned in the opening is that you began to, to craft strategies, and you also used some behavioral sciences in some of the projects. Talk a little bit about that, how that interacted, how that was involved, and how you developed some programs.
Yeah. So behavioral science, it covers a lot of things. Things like decision makings, biases, social influences, and just, of course, our habits. So when we're kind of using that, we think about, in terms of communications, especially, corporate or government communications, how people are going to get that information and what makes sense to them. So that frame, that message, how are they getting? But, a great example is kind of, easy to understand in a podcast setting is you can't just say it once. You can't just say it twice. There's a often repeated statistic, and it might be apocryphal, especially it's changed over time, that people need to hear things 7 to 14 times to really internalize and act. And that's been repeated for a long time. So we think, how can people get that information 7 to 14 times or as often as possible? And now one thing I really like to focus on is how can we get it out there over as many touch points as possible. So, of course, phones, desktops, computers, tablets are where people are really getting things. TV, of course, still very expensive and not used the most by, a lot of the businesses I'm working for, and a lot of, the smaller government agencies are using it less. You see it a lot for Medicare open enrollment. You see the government using TV. But for me, it was mostly, getting it out there online. So it's using things like paid ads, which there are different biases towards paid ads. Either, it's an ad, I ignore it, then that was kind of sneaky. They used sponsored content, and it was, light gray that it said sponsored, hard to see on white. Not sure, that's a little deceptive. So that was a different bias towards it. So you just got to really be repetitive with that. And that's something we try over and over again to be effective doing.
Mm-hmm. You know, one of the things that, as I listen to you talk about that, that comes to mind that some years ago I was doing some lobbying for AT&T here in Nashville because they wanted to get cable systems into all over the state. But the biggest issue for them were, and for where the tough spots came, were rural areas. You know, you don't have a lot of people, but you've got to put out a lot of cables to get the system there, and the government required it. So there was a lot of negotiation that had to go on about that, in terms of how people receive it. But it was imperative that they did if they wanted that to receive the license to do that. So, they had to sit down with the government to decide what they were going to do and make the arrangements. I mean, that's the bottom line. So those are some of the other things that have to be, when you talk about experiences, have to deal with, how do people get their information? Yes, I mean, they get the newspaper, but the government, if you want to have that cable TV system out there, which they wanted them to do, because the government also uses it, then you've got to put the wires out there, like it or not, and expensive or not, and you find some way to pay for it. But it has to be done.
Yeah, actually, I've always found, the economics and social area around, wiring. Today it's fiber, but getting that cable laid across the entire country just to be one of the most interesting communications challenges. And I think it's been done very well because we have, first phone, then cable TV, and now, high-speed internet across a lot of the country. Mm-hmm. And it's a lot of land to cover. So you would know, having, done that with AT&T, it's just, even in one state, it's a lot to cover. And we do a great job overall. There are, of course, patches where it's not, but present or it's slower. But over time, it does reach.
Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about, let's say, it's maybe some of the more compelling projects that you've been working on, that had the biggest mountain to climb to solve the problem. But through, your experiences and joining with other colleagues that you did come up with a way to get the job done. Have you had those kind of experiences?
Yeah. So there are probably two big, buckets companies will fall into. One is they are a total blank slate. They really haven't done much in terms of their communications. And the other is they've done a lot, and it's a little disjointed. And both of those present two very different challenges. So let's talk a little about, the blank slate one. They're a company, they have been around for, maybe 10-ish years, but outside of their kind of small community, they're not as well known as they'd like to be. Mm-hmm. A lot of that's kind of working with them and building up audiences, because you kind of have to have that first. So we look at, do they have email lists? Like, what can we use that they have already in place? Because they're really not starting as much from zero as they often think. They've collected emails over however many years of clients, of vendors, of whomever they work with. They have their LinkedIn networks. They might have a Twitter X page that they occasionally used. So what can we do with that to make it work a little better? Mm-hmm. And leverage existing things. And once we kind of talk with a client about that, I was working with a firm that did a little bit of work in the energy sector. I don't want to give them away because I don't want to kind of disclose what they've done in that, but they had a lot of that because they've collected these things. And once we told them, here's what we can do, they were a lot more comfortable. Because when they think they have nothing, This is true with a lot of companies, not just this one. They get a little nervous.
Mm-hmm.
And when they're nervous, they may make, this goes back to behavioral science, irrational decisions or based on poor information. People are more comfortable in their decisions.
Mm-hmm.
So we took everything they had, kind of assigned some value to it. Okay, this is a really valuable email list you have. We can use that and start creating email sequences for everything from onboarding, to get people on, and also just email marketing. Tell people what you're doing, just updates.
Mm-hmm.
Once we kind of starting from that, it was able to grow a little more.
We'll be back after a quick break.
Marketing is a puzzle. You can either give into the confusion or learn to love the solve. On the Axiom's Real Talk About Marketing podcast, guests like Aaron Schaefer of GM share how to manage challenges.
Make sure that you're not fixed in terms of what you're thinking about. The team's going to change, and the way teams operate are going to change. COVID was a great example of that. The industry is going to change. Are cookies going away or not? That was another great example of that. And so how do you continue to evolve as the space evolves?
Guests from HP, The Trade Desk, and Databricks share thoughts on today's marketing landscape. Find Real Talk About Marketing on YouTube, Axiom.com, or wherever you hear podcasts.
One of the things that I think has come out in terms of what you sort of just described there, and I think it's important for public relations people to understand, is that part of your job is problem solving. How do you help a client get over this particular hump or clear this particular hurdle to get this particular message out, or whatever it happens to be? So the more and the wider your experiences have been, and the more exposure you've had to a lot of operations and processes and electronics and computers and so forth, really helps to solve those problems, because that's why they have you there. How can you help me get this job done? And the better prepared you are, the better off you're going to be.
Yes, and we are, we look at things as a particular job. Of course, they have a goal they want to accomplish, but we think of it, we are, chief communications officers for our clients, which means that we are fractional. So it is much more, we are integrated into what you do. It's not, we are here to do your email marketing.
Mm-hmm.
We are really here to shape perception and build trust, maintain that trust long term. So it's not, we are just here to launch a product. We are just here to manage your social media. It's how are all these things working together.
Mm-hmm. Now, have you also been in a position where you had to introduce them to new programs and or platforms that could facilitate the work that they're doing?
All the time.
Okay. Okay.
All the time. It's a very common thing. And, one of the reasons for that is, we are the communications experts. We're the experts at communicating your expertise. You are the expert in whatever it is you do, be it healthcare, energy, IT, government. We don't expect you to know every platform or every tool out there. Just like we are not experts in, performing surgery if you're a healthcare client. Like, we just aren't, because we are not surgeons. So all the time, it's kind of bringing them in. And there are ways we do that to, introduce these new products or new platforms for them. And usually it's easy. There isn't a lot of pushback in general, because, we're not saying use product A or use this email delivery system. It's much more, we, like using a couple of these, for email, and we'll give a list.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not trying to endorse any particular product or service, third-party service here. So I'm not, going to start selling them. But, here's a list of, 3 or 4 that we've used. Here are the benefits and drawbacks to each, because every platform has ups and downs.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing will do everything, and nothing will do it all great. So we lay it out that way, and I found that when you provide those options, not limitless options, but a discrete list of 3 or 4 that kind of do similar things, email marketing or social media management or research. If, we're in an early stage here, we kind of want to just know the lay of the industry, get that lay of the land there, how we do it. And then they feel they are a little more comfortable. And a lot of times, I get, a response of, well, it doesn't really matter to us which platform you use as long as we get a result.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. They're a little less concerned, with is it, product A or product B. They just want their thing done.
Right.
They don't care if I use Microsoft Word or, Google Docs.
Mm-hmm.
It makes no difference to them who my email provider is. Same thing. They just want to see that value come out.
Well, and I think it's important that you, as we just sort of mentioned, that you do point those things out to them, because a lot of folks who have been in some of these jobs, when you talk about the government, they've been there for years, and maybe they don't get the exposure to the different platforms that are coming out because maybe their agency just hadn't had a need for them, and they continue to do things the way as a lot of folks say, well, this is the way we've always done it. Well, maybe that started back years ago, and things have changed. And so they do need things. I mean, yes, it's expeditious. It's there to help you do your job better and faster, I guess is the best way I put it to people. And the government, for the most part, can't afford them because, some of this stuff is really not outrageous in cost. It's just effective in terms of being able to use it, and it helps you get your job done quicker, faster, and in some cases better.
It is. And, you kind of touched on, kind of laying these options out. That's what I do in pretty much every situation with a client or on a project I'm working on is, I start with, my very first conversation before they are even officially a client to that point. And it says, my job is not to tell you only things you want to hear. It's to give you options. It's to tell you pros and cons. It's to tell you challenges and help you make a decision.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm here to work with you through that, but not only to tell you the things that you want to hear. And I think that does help build some confidence that they know, okay, from the very beginning, it's not all rosy. There are pros and cons across the board, and I will be very upfront with that.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, too, because that was the very next thing I was going to say, that, all decisions have consequences. So the more you know about what it is you want to get, and you want to have done, and how you want it to be done, here's some of the platforms that can help you get there. Maybe there's some pros and cons a little bit about this one or that one, but rather than you're still using some old equipment, here's some new stuff. It's better, it's faster, and it's making your life a lot easier. That's what a lot of folks like to hear.
Yeah. And I think what they like to hear is that it's also, especially you mentioned this, lower cost.
Oh, at lower cost.
Because a lot of these services, they're out there and they seem like it's just another subscription. And I know we all have subscription fatigue, but they can, when used judiciously, improve results.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean go buy every subscription to every service. But the right ones can really help you, and some of these products do make a huge difference.
Well, the other thing, too, that, particularly whether it's the government or otherwise, there are a lot of platforms that are out there that do excellent jobs for you, and they happen to be free.
Yes.
I do my recording. I'm recording on Audacity right now. It's one of the better audio platforms in the world, as a matter of fact. I've been using for years, and it is maybe number one in some people's eyes and number two in some others, but it has a lot of features. It can do a lot of things for you, and the cost is zero.
Yeah. I've always been a fan of free, especially open source software and tools. Some people knock it because, it's free. I'm like, yeah, it's free.
And it's good. That's the other part of it.
Well, some of them are great.
Right.
Some of them I wouldn't want to use. But the great ones really are on par, or in some cases better, than subscription options. They might require a little more technical knowledge to use. But some of these free open source platforms are great. They're out there.
And they've been around for years, which sort of validates how well they've been working.
And, you look at some of the platforms, things like Audacity, others out there, some web hosting content management systems. They have great communities behind them that do this open source work. And some of them, some of these platforms actually have resources in major companies that, since they use them, those big companies put teams on maintaining them.
Well, Jonathan, this has been a great discussion on some of the things that you've done and how you've gone about doing those. Any closing remarks for the audience?
Yeah, I would always say, one thing we talk about is, communicate strategically, not voluminously. Be smart about your message.
Well, I certainly tip my hat and go along with that one. That's a hugely important thing to say. And let me say this. I want to thank you for coming on to the Public Relations Review podcast and sharing your wisdom with our audience. And
thank you for having me.
And I'm sure they're going to get a great deal from this. From our audience, I'd like to say thank you for joining us. Once again, you continue to make us a global podcast. And if you've enjoyed the show, we'd certainly like for you to go to the Public Relations Review Podcast.com website and leave a review for us. And also share the fact that you've enjoyed this particular episode with your friends and colleagues. And listen to us for the next edition of the Public Relations Review Podcast.
This podcast is produced by Communication Strategies, an award-winning public relations and public affairs firm headquartered in Nashville, Tennessee. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, this is Peter Woolfolk. First, let me say thank you so much for being a listener. Now, I want to alert you to our shiny new podcast website located at podpage.com. However, you can go directly to the podcast site located at publicrelationsreviewpodcast.com. There, you can contact me through email. You can leave a voice message. You can leave a review. You can read an episode blog and frequently learn about the podcast guests. You might also want to suggest podcast topic ideas or even suggest a guest. You can also let me know if you would like to receive our podcast listener logo that you can post on your social media. So I look forward to hearing from you about our new podcast website. Thank you so much for listening to the Public Relations Review podcast, and have a great day.